topic is business management and social sciences, reflections and directions for future research. In order to talk about directions for the future, though, we must reflect on the past. I'm a political scientist by background, and my academic interest is in the area of corporate social responsibility. When I reflect on the past 40 to 50 years of public and academic debate on the subject, I see three broad changes, maybe even revolutions, in the role of the corporation in society that strike me as noteworthy and that set the direction for future research. Although I think that what I'm going to say will have broader implications, I should mention that my focus will be on American corporations, just because that's the focus of my research interests. And I'll be speaking of broad trends. So there are probably many exceptions to what I'm going to say, but I'm speaking very broadly. So the first change is this. 40 or 50 years ago, critics of corporate behavior argued that businesses have social responsibilities that go beyond whatever the baseline law requires. So businesses should help their local communities build schools and hospitals, not just through their tax contributions, but through philanthropy. And businesses should clean up their environmental waste and make sure their products are safe, not just if regulations require them to do so, but even if they don't. By contrast, most managers, along with defenders of the market system like Milton Friedman, argued that corporations had no business being socially responsible or doing anything other than serving the interests of the shareholders. Businessmen and businesswomen, Friedman said, lack the knowledge or expertise to address social problems. A manager has no idea where to locate a hospital or what kind of school is the best one to build, nor, unlike elected politicians, are managers in a position to be held accountable by the public for the way they decide to clean up the environment or improve product safety. Maybe the public has a different view, and so managers lack legitimacy in making these kinds of decisions. That was 40 years ago. Much has changed. Today, it's a growing number of business people who argue that, compared with governments, corporations actually command greater expertise and legitimacy when it comes to addressing social issues. According to this view, inefficient and ineffectual elected governments have lost legitimacy in the eyes of voters, and they are staffed by bureaucrats whose expertise in many areas is far less impressive than that possessed by the kinds of experts that businesses can afford to hire, such as environmental technologists, healthcare specialists, experts in education and training. So business people are beginning to shoulder government out of the way in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere, using wealth generated by their corporations to fund their own initiatives in policy areas like healthcare, science, education, social welfare, and so forth. For example, the Gates Foundation, which is funded by the wealth Bill Gates created at Microsoft, has given over $100 million to support the creation of a set of common core standards in American schools. Accordingly, it's now critics of corporations, mostly progressive political activists, who deny that business people have either the legitimacy to assume social responsibilities, nobody elected them, or even have the objective expertise, since after all, business people and the corporations see things from their own self-interested perspective. One writer, for example, criticized Bill Gates for trying to be, and I'm quoting, the unelected superintendent of American schools. By undertaking their own initiatives in social, educational, and health policy, critics are now saying, corporations are usurping the role of government. So that's one change that's occurred over the last 40 years. Critics of corporations used to demand that businesses get involved in resolving social problems, while managers resisted. Now it's just as likely to be managers who are thinking about taking initiatives in resolving social problems and critics who are resisting. Here's another change. It has to do not with the extent to which corporations should or should not take over government's role, but how much influence corporations should have over government decisions. So 40 or 50 years ago, managers vigorously defended the rights of corporations in America and elsewhere to spend money lobbying government to get it to pass legislation favorable to corporate interests. Critics of corporations complained about this practice. After all, if a corporation had a lot of money to spend hiring high-priced lobbyists to get politicians to lower its taxes, an anti-poverty group, meanwhile, with very meager resources, could barely get a hearing from officials when it wanted taxes increased in order to support social programs. 50 years later, now, it's corporations who would rather not engage government on many policy matters, while it's their critics who want the corporation to do so. Think of the Disney Corporation, whose managers preferred to remain silent about a piece of legislation in Florida that had to do with the discussion of sexual orientation in public schools. Meanwhile, it was Disney's critics, including many of its own consumers and employees, who insisted that the company use its influence with the government in Florida to oppose the legislation. So the second change is that while 50 years ago, critics of corporations opposed corporate attempts to influence government, while managers supported it, now, much more often than it used to be, it's managers who are saying that the corporation really has no business attempting to influence government, while corporate critics are demanding that they do so. Here's the third and final change. 40 or 50 years ago, shareholders, consumers, suppliers, and employees competed over corporate resources. When academics proposed the stakeholder theory of the firm around 30 years ago, they gave legitimacy to this conflict, to the idea that it wasn't shareholders alone, but all these other corporate constituents as well, who had a rightful claim to corporate wealth. Maybe shareholders should sacrifice some profits so that employees could be paid a better wage, or that suppliers could, in their supply chain, could create better working conditions in their factories or farms, or so that consumers could pay a lower price. And of course, all of these stakeholder groups really were competing with each other as well, not just with shareholders. Putting more money back into the consumer's pocket meant less money for higher wages for workers, for example. This kind of conflict, of course, still rages. It hasn't been replaced, but something new has come up alongside of it. Stakeholder groups are now beginning to compete not only over economic resources of the corporation, but political matters. And their competition is much more directly with each other, with the corporation simply acting as kind of a field of combat. So, for example, investors are threatening to pull out of companies that sell to a consumer whose politics they oppose, as when Amazon shareholders opposed that company's sale of facial recognition technology, which can be racially biased, to the United States government. Consumers recently organized a boycott of Goya Foods in the United States when its CEO indicated his personal support for Donald Trump, thus targeting the personal political views of a corporate employee. Facebook employees walked out in protest over their company's willingness to draw on suppliers of content whose political views they opposed. Suppliers are threatening to no longer do business with a company if some of its investors have taken political positions they dislike, as when an American beverage company refused to supply its products to a restaurant in Washington, D.C., unless it changed its owners because of the restaurant's opposition to certain COVID restrictions. Some of these kinds of activities were not totally unheard of decades ago, but they're much more common today. Now, I have characterized these three changes as revolutions, but in fact, they are evolutions. Let me restate them in that evolutionary frame. Decades ago, when critics of corporations wanted businesses to be socially responsible, they had in mind activities that tended to fall very much within the corporation's sphere of interest. They were thinking largely of corporate support for the local community, as well as the responsibility of a company to clean up after its environmental waste or ensure that its products were safe beyond what the law might have required. Today, when it's managers who are promoting corporate social responsibility, the social responsibility they're talking about often falls way outside the corporation's sphere of interest, as when corporate wealth, like Bill Gates's, funds education, health, social policy, and other initiatives that have little to do with their company's original mission. Likewise, decades ago, when businesses defended corporate engagement with government, the engagement concerned policies that fell within the corporation's sphere of interest. Automobile companies lobbying government to minimize regulation on certain safety issues, or the financial services industry lobbying for the deregulation of certain financial products. Today, when it's corporate critics who are trying to push for corporations engaging the government, it's on policies, again, that lie outside the corporation's sphere of interest, as, for example, with Disney and the question of whether sexual orientation should be discussed in public schools. That has nothing really to do with Walt Disney's mission as a corporation. Meanwhile, it's managers who are saying that corporations should not engage government on issues outside their sphere of interest. In support of Disney's hesitancy to lobby government on the schools issue, for example, the CEO of the cryptocurrency company Coinbase declared, and I'm quoting, that it's inappropriate for a corporation to lobby government on broader social issues that are unrelated to its core mission. And finally, 30 or 40 years ago, corporate stakeholders battled each other over something that lay very much within the corporation's sphere of influence or sphere of interest, namely the corporation's own wealth and resources and how best to divide them. But today, battles between stakeholders are ranging over issues that lie far afield from anything the corporation might care about. An employee's support for a presidential candidate, for example, or the American government's immigration policies and how it might use facial recognition technology in enforcing them. So in short, over the past 40 years, the corporation in America and increasingly elsewhere is turning from an economic into a political institution. A transformation is occurring, one pushing the corporation from being an economic entity, minding its own business, into a much more avowedly political one, with a role, theoretically, in just about any political issue or social issue that anybody wants to use it to take a role in. Both managers and their critics, both capitalists and their opponents, are pulling the corporation in this direction. We haven't yet begun to understand the implications of this change. And here I will move from the past to the future of social scientific research and management. If you look at business schools across America and Europe, you will see that they are populated by social scientists. With the exception of the field of operations research, whose scholars are applied mathematicians, you will find that marketing departments are populated to no small degree by psychologists, organizational behavior departments by sociologists and psychologists, finance and economics departments by economists, and strategy departments by academics from all of these fields, as well as perhaps the law, from law schools. But where are the political scientists? After all, political science, along with sociology, economics, and psychology, is a foundational social science. It's true, some business schools do have social scientists on faculty, often in their strategy departments. But what do they write about? To a large degree, it's about questions that have been around for 40 or 50 years, the extent to which corporate lobbying on matters of interest to the corporation, regulatory issues affecting business, is successful or unsuccessful, or is a good thing or a bad thing. Otherwise, they tend to write about political science issues that have little to do with business at all, such as voting procedures in legislatures. So on our topic, business management and social sciences, reflections and directions for future research, I've given you my reflections on the recent past. The corporation is becoming a more deeply and perhaps irrevocably political institution than ever before. And my principal suggestion for future social scientific research is a very broad and simple one. In this day and age, when the corporation is moving from being an economic to becoming a much more political entity, let's engage in social scientific research on the corporation going forward, the one social science that hasn't been marshaled really so far. Let's send in the political scientists. That's it.
Thank you, Professor Andrew. Thank you very much for covering the business side and the social science side in a very comprehensive way. With your permission, I'm just stopping now recording.